In the context of the millennia of history, how do you think this year will be seen?
Oh, well, I'm not sure it will be remembered. You know, when you're in the midst of a historical event, you're usually convinced this is the most important thing that ever happened. But then after a few decades, not just a few millennia, after a few decades, people hardly remember it. And we've seen it with previous epidemics. Epidemics in general tend to leave a much smaller imprint on history than people assume. If you think about the big influenza epidemic of 1918, for example, it had a far smaller impact than the First World War, even though it killed more people. If you think about art, just compare the number of books and poems and TV series about the First World War to the basically non-existent crop of poems and books and TV series about the influenza. Now, this may be changing now because the nature of pandemics is changing. Throughout most of history, pandemics were seen as natural disasters beyond the control of humans. So they were, in this sense, less interesting. Now, because of our scientific capabilities, pandemics have become a political disaster or a political failure. If there is a pandemic, it's no longer a natural disaster, it's a political failure. And therefore, they are also becoming much more interesting because politics is always more interesting to people than natural disasters.
I sense from reading your books that, well, one, you make very clear that obviously the capitalism won over communism, but I don't think you're a sort of total believer in the longevity, in the future longevity of capitalism. Mm-hmm. Do you think capitalism will endure, or is that just going to be one of these things that has its moment and then disappears?
It's a question of time scale. If you ask me in terms of years and maybe even decades, it will endure. You don't see any serious competition at the present. But if you think in terms of generations and centuries, then something else will come along because capitalism is not part of the laws of nature. It's not like physics or chemistry. It's really just a story that people came up with about how the world works and how the world should work. Things like corporations and corporate law and money and banks and all this, these are our creations. They exist only in our own imagination. They are not objective entities or objective laws of nature. And they couldn't even exist in many previous eras, in many previous civilizations, because you didn't have the necessary cultural foundations to believe in such things. So at the present moment, we created a world which is conducive to these capitalist institutions and stories and mythologies, and it works better than all the alternatives. But things change. And, one of the hallmarks of capitalism, or at least free market capitalism, which is the dominant version of capitalism, is that centralized control of the economy doesn't work. And one of the main reasons that centralized control of the economy indeed failed to work in the 20th century is because people or institutions lack the capacity to process all the information in one place. If you wanted to manage the entire Soviet economy in Moscow, it meant you needed to bring enormous amount of information to one place, process it there, and make all the decisions there and send the commands, the orders everywhere. Yeah. And you just couldn't do it with 20th century technology. It was inefficient. Dispersing the information and dispersing the power to make decisions between many players was more efficient. But this is, again, it's not a law of nature that it's always like that. It's only under 20th century technological conditions. Now, the rise, especially of artificial intelligence and big data algorithms, may change that. Maybe we are entering an era in which it is possible to concentrate and process all the information in one place, that actually it has an advantage over spreading it between many different players. and then a central command economy might become more efficient than a free market capitalist economy. And it's not a prophecy, it's just a possibility that we need to take into account. Through most of history, when you look at most ancient civilizations and cultures, they did not function in a capitalist way. So, I mean, you can argue, maybe you can imagine that capitalism was always the natural way to do things, and it was kind of stopped by all these religious and cultural and political institutions that until finally in the modern age, it was liberated from all these impediments and the natural thing could finally run its course. But it's very, as a historian, I find it very unconvincing to think that for most of human history, something unnatural was happening. And finally, in the last 2-3 centuries, somehow the natural laws manifested themselves. I mean, you just need to think that, like any economy, capitalism works on trust. And what makes capitalism really unique and successful is its ability to generate enormous trust between complete strangers. Without trust, there are no markets. Without trust, there is no credit, there is no money. Money is actually just trust. If you ask what money is, I mean, money can be anything. It can be paper, it can be gold, it can be electronic bits on your computer. If we have a contract and I break the contract and you take me to court, it's a free market, so I pay the judge to rule in my favor. In such a system, of course, capitalism collapses. It needs at least something that doesn't work on free market principle, that the judge won't rule in favor of the person that pays the highest bribe. We can have surveillance. We need surveillance to fight epidemics. We need big data and algorithms and AI to have better healthcare. But how can we have them and still protect our privacy and our democratic values? And there are ways to do it. One principle is that whenever you collect data on people, the data is used to help the people and not to control or manipulate them or to benefit third parties. I mean, it sounds simple, but in many cases today it's not done. The data collected is used for the benefit of somebody else. The second principle is that whenever you increase surveillance from top to bottom, you must balance it by increasing surveillance from bottom upwards. But okay, the government needs to monitor me more to prevent epidemics, that's fine, on condition that simultaneously new systems are created to monitor what the government is doing. Like in this crisis, governments are spending enormous amounts of money. Like we just heard about the $1.7 trillion package passed in the US. So we need better systems that make it very easy for citizens, for individuals to see who is getting the money, who is making the decisions. And this creates a balance. So, okay, they know more about me, I know more about them. And the third principle is that never to allow too much data to be concentrated in just one place, whether it's a government or a corporation, because this is really the high road to totalitarianism. We are now at a point in history that if you have enough data and computing power, you can basically hack human beings and know them better than they know themselves. So to prevent this, we need to prevent the over-concentration of data. And again, it doesn't matter if it's concentrated in the hands of a government or of a corporation. Both are equally dangerous.
You say, way back in the day, as it were, humans had no more impact on the environment than gorillas, fireflies, and jellyfish. That, of course, is not the case today. We have colossal impact on the planet. The other week, just before your latest essay for the FT, Bill Gates wrote a piece for the Weekend FT, in which he optimistically argued that we will innovate our way through the climate crisis, that the world won't be destroyed by climate change because humanity will will innovate and will find the technology to defeat it. What's your take on that?
So the big question is, who are we? Some humans will survive climate change, but billions of humans might suffer tremendously or die because of it. So, you know, there is no single future to all humans. And that's especially true of things like COVID, of things like climate change. So some humans will survive, but billions of humans might not. And that should be a very big concern for everybody.